Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today because together we're going to go through one of the darkest and most tragic criminal cases of the 1990s in the Czech Republic. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe and turn on your doorbell so you don't miss any more episodes about real-life crime cases. Today, I'll tell you a story that shocked the whole society and which unfortunately revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the system at that time. It's a case that has become a symbol of the importance of vetting people who work with children. Get ready for the story of Jaroslav Oplistil. May Day, 1999. While most people were celebrating Labor Day and looking forward to spring days full of hope in a newly free Czechoslovakia, a tragedy took place in Prague's Nabulovka hospital that changed one family's life forever. A 7-month-old girl named Barborka was abducted directly from the children's ward, raped and brutally murdered. The perpetrator was a 33-year-old paramedic, Jaroslav Oplistil, a man with a criminal history of sexual offenses against children. How is it possible that such a man could even work in a children's ward? How did he become an orderly in a hospital just months after his release from prison? And what role did Václav Havel's presidential amnesty play in the whole case? I will answer all these questions today. This case is extremely difficult and sensitive, so I ask you to respect the victim and his family. Let us look together at what actually happened at the time. In order to fully understand how such a terrible tragedy could have occurred, we need to go back to the 1980s and look at who Jaroslav Oplistil actually was and what he had been through. His story is a story of repeated failure. A story of a man who had clearly visible dangerous tendencies and yet found himself in a situation where he could hurt the most vulnerable. Jaroslav Oplistil was born in the 1950s and grew up in socialist Czechoslovakia. Unfortunately, we do not know much about his early childhood and family background, because this information was not publicly available at the time, and the media did not focus much on psychological profiles of perpetrators. What we do know for sure, however, is that he exhibited disturbing sexual deviations as an adult, targeting children. His criminal career began sometime in the early 1980s. At that time, he committed various offenses, including petty theft, which appeared on his criminal record. While these thefts were relatively minor compared to what came later, they showed a man who had no respect for the laws and norms of society. He was a man who simply took what he wanted, regardless of the consequences. But what was really alarming was his sexual deviance. He showed clear signs of pedophilia, sexual attraction to children. And it wasn't just an attraction that remained in the realm of fantasy. Oplistil actively acted on his compulsion and committed sexual offenses against underage children. These acts were not random or one-off. They were part of a pattern of behavior that was repeated and escalated. The turning point in his criminal history was the year 1986. It was in that year that he committed the acts that led to his first serious conviction. The crime scene was the town of Jablonec nad Nisou, a beautiful North Bohemian town known for its jewelry production. But in this case, there was nothing beautiful going on. Oplistil then used a classic, unfortunately very effective tactic that predators often use to lure children. He approached 2 little girls, one 7 years old, the other 9. He told them he would get them puppies. Children of that age find the offer of puppies irresistible. A puppy means a friend, joy, something soft and cute. These little girls had no idea they were following a predator into a trap. He took the girls into the woods, a place far from civilization where no one could hear their cries for help. There, he showed his true self. First, he began to threaten them. He told them he would strangle them if they didn't listen. Imagine the horror. 2 little girls, 7 and 9 years old, alone in the woods with a grown man threatening them with death. They must have been absolutely terrified. He forced them to undress. He wanted to see their naked children's bodies. Then he started touching them in a way no one should ever touch a child. But it wasn't just that he was touching them. He was forcing these girls to touch his penis. He wanted them to actively participate in his perverted fantasy. This isn't just sexual abuse, it's psychological torture, a traumatization that has probably haunted these children their entire lives. We don't know exactly how long this horror lasted. We don't know how the girls managed to escape, or whether Oplistil eventually let them go. What we do know is that their families found out about it, and the case was reported to the police. In the socialist Czechoslovakia of the 1980s, such cases were not much talked about. Child sexual abuse was taboo, something that was not spoken about out loud. But in this case, the evidence was too much to be swept under the carpet. The police arrested Oplistil, and the case was taken to court. The trial was conducted according to the laws and standards of the time. Oplistil was accused of sexually abusing two underage girls, which was considered a serious crime under the Penal Code. The court found him guilty, and in the year 1986 he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. 5 years for destroying the innocence of two little girls. 5 years for luring them into the woods under false pretenses, threatening them with death, forcing them to undress and sexually abusing them. Looking at it today, it may seem like a relatively light sentence, but in the context of the 1980s and the legal system at the time, it was a standard punishment for this type of crime, so he went to prison. He was to spend 5 years there, which meant that he would be released sometime in the year 1991. During his time in prison, he probably participated in some kind of program, maybe worked, maybe tried to behave himself to earn some benefits. But internally, his sexual deviance hasn't gone anywhere. Pedophilia is not something that is cured by a few years in prison without intensive therapy. It's important to remember that Oplistil's actions in the year 1986 were not isolated. He had other criminal records, though not as serious. But the pattern was clear. He was a repeat offender, a man who returned to crime repeatedly. And with sex offenses against children, recidivism is particularly dangerous because the level of violence and risk often increases with each additional offense. When we look at the psychological profile of such a person, we see someone who has a disturbed capacity for empathy, who sees children not as human beings with rights and feelings, but as objects of their sexual desire. He is a person who is willing to use manipulation, lies, and violence to achieve his goals, and most frighteningly, he is a man who probably doesn't even feel guilty for what he has done. This is the Jaroslav Oplistil we meet in the 1980s, a convicted child sexual predator, a man who should never under any circumstances be around children. And yet it was just such a man who was put in a position where he had daily contact with the most vulnerable children, sick babies and toddlers in hospital. How could this have happened? We'll look at that in the next parts of this video. Now we come to an event that has profoundly affected this story. To make sense of it, I have to take you back to December 1989. The Velvet Revolution had just changed the face of Czechoslovakia. After decades of communist totalitarianism, freedom finally arrived. Václav Havel, dissident playwright and symbol of resistance to the regime, became president. He was a symbol of hope, of a new beginning, of the moral awakening of the nation. And it was in this spirit, in the spirit of great forgiveness and a new beginning, that one of his first presidential decisions came. January 1st, 1999. While the whole country was celebrating a new year and a new era, Václav Havel announced an amnesty that went down in history as one of the most extensive in the post-war history of Czechoslovakia. Some called it the Great Amnesty, others the Amnesty of Hope. What were the conditions of this amnesty? Let's examine it in detail, because it is in these details that the key to understanding how a dangerous offender could have been set free lies. First, the amnesty applied to persons sentenced to prison terms of up to 2 and in some cases up to 3 years. For these people, the sentence was completely remitted. They could simply go home from prison without having to serve the rest of their sentence. Secondly, for those sentenced to higher sentences, the situation was slightly different. Their sentences were reduced by 1/3 to 1/2. This meant that a person who had served, say, 10 years could be released after 5 years or even earlier. Thirdly, the amnesty also applied to people in custody or those facing a maximum of 3 years in prison. For these people, the prosecution was completely halted. Imagine that. You are awaiting trial for some offense, and suddenly you are told that the whole thing is cancelled, that you can go home. Fourthly, The amnesty did not abolish the sentence itself, nor the obligation to compensate for the damage caused. This meant that, in theory, you still had a record of conviction on your record, even though you might not have served your sentence. Now for the important question: did the amnesty apply to everyone? No, absolutely not. Havel and his lawyers were aware that it was impossible to release all prisoners indiscriminately. That is why exceptions were made. The amnesty did not apply to perpetrators of murder. It didn't apply to rapists. It did not apply to robbery offenders. And it did not apply to particularly dangerous repeat offenders, that is, people who returned to crime repeatedly and posed a clear danger to society. But there was a fundamental problem here. How do we actually define a particularly dangerous repeat offender? Who exactly fell into this category and who did not? What about sexual offenses against children? These were not explicitly listed as a separate category in the list of exceptions, so if someone was not convicted directly of rape in the legal sense, but perhaps of sexual abuse, they could theoretically fall under the amnesty. And that's exactly what happened. Some 23,000 people out of a total of 31,000 prisoners were released from Czechoslovak prisons within a few weeks. This means that almost 2/3 of all prisoners suddenly found themselves free. Imagine the logistical chaos. Imagine the wave of people who suddenly came out of prisons and returned to society. Havel's motivation was pure and noble. He wanted to make it clear that a new era brings a new attitude. He wanted to make it clear that the communist justice system often sentenced people unjustly, for political opinions, for small things, for things that would not be a crime in a normal democratic society. He wanted to give a second chance to those who deserved it. And in many cases, it was the right decision. But unfortunately, as is often the case, doing good can have unintended consequences, and one of those consequences was releasing people who didn't deserve a second chance and who posed a real danger. Now let's move on to the second part of this chapter: how a released prisoner was able to become an orderly in the children's ward of a prestigious Prague hospital. Na Bulovce Hospital in Prague. A large, well-known hospital with a long history. A place where hundreds of patients are treated every day, including the smallest ones, babies and toddlers. The children's ward was a place full of cots, crying babies, tired parents, and dedicated medical staff. In the spring of 1990, just a few months after the amnesty was announced, the hospital was looking for new staff. At that time, the situation in the health sector was quite complicated. The country was undergoing transformation. Salaries in the health sector were not very high, and it was difficult to find quality staff, especially for positions that did not require a university degree: orderlies, cleaners, support staff. A recently released prisoner applied for one such position, that of an orderly in the children's ward. Someone who was looking for a job, who needed to start a new life. Someone who looked like a normal job seeker. The hospital's Human Resources Department conducted a standard recruitment process. Interviewed, checked references, maybe some medical records. But there was one crucial thing the HR department couldn't check: the applicant's criminal history. Why not? This brings us to what I mentioned in the title, the systemic hole in the system at the time. After the amnesty was announced, there was administrative chaos. Criminal records were not digitized as they are today. Information was not updated in real time. Most importantly, employers did not have automatic access to the criminal records of their potential employees. In a normal situation, an employer would be able to request a criminal record extract. But in those days, in the post-revolutionary chaos, it wasn't so easy. The system was overburdened, processes were slow, and, most importantly, there was no legal obligation mandating that employers in the health or education sectors had to run criminal background checks on their employees, especially those who would be working with children. This meant that Na Bulovce Hospital hired an orderly without having the slightest idea about his background. The personnel department did not know that this person had spent 4 years in prison. They didn't know why he was there. They didn't know that he had a propensity for child sexual abuse. They just didn't know anything about it. So he became an orderly in the children's ward. He was given a white coat, an employee pass, keys to various rooms. He became part of the team. The doctors and nurses talked to him as a colleague. They trusted him. Why wouldn't they trust him? He seemed like a normal employee. His job involved a variety of tasks, helping nurses, transferring patients, cleaning, preparing supplies. He had access to patient rooms. He had access to children, to the most vulnerable, defenseless patients who couldn't even scream for help because they were too small. Imagine the irony. A place that was supposed to be a symbol of safety and healing became a hunting ground for a predator. Parents brought their sick children to the hospital believing that they would be safe here, that they would be cared for by qualified staff. And no one, not the doctors, not the nurses, not the parents, knew that a man with such a dark past walked among them. No one had the slightest chance of finding out. The system failed all along the line. The amnesty may have been well-intentioned, but its implementation and subsequent administration created a hole through which innocent people fell. And the greatest tragedy was that those who paid the ultimate price were the children. April 30th, 1990. It was Monday, the eve of Labor Day. All of Czechoslovakia was preparing for a long weekend, for celebrations, for May Day trips. The weather was pleasant. Spring was in full swing. People were looking forward to days off. But in the children's ward of the hospital na Bulovce, one of the most difficult days in the history of this institution was coming to an end. The evening shift was in full swing. Nurses were going round the rooms, checking on the little patients, administering medicines, changing diapers. Dozens of children of different ages, from newborns to older toddlers, were hospitalized in the ward. Some children had common childhood illnesses, others had more serious health problems. Parents were only allowed to be with their children at certain hours, so by the evening most of them had gone home, and the children remained under the supervision of the medical staff. Among the hospitalized children was little Barbara. She was only 7 months old. She was a little girl who still had her whole life ahead of her. Her parents had waited 10 long years for her. 10 years full of hope, disappointment, doctor visits, maybe even artificial insemination or other procedures. And then finally she came, their dream daughter. You can imagine how they loved her, how they cherished her, how they rejoiced every day at every smile, every new sound she made. Now she was in the hospital for some medical problem. We don't know exactly what it was, whether it was an infection, breathing problems, or some other complication that young children sometimes have at this age. The important thing is that her parents entrusted her to the care of the hospital with complete confidence that she would be safe here, that she would be cared for by professionals, and that she would soon recover and return home. Barbara was lying in her cot. She was probably wearing a small hospital pajama or just a diaper and a t-shirt, as is usual with such small children. Maybe she had a toy, a stuffed animal that her parents had given her so she wouldn't be alone. There were other cribs with other children around her. Some were sleeping, some were crying, some were playing quietly. The orderly was on night duty that day. His job was to help the nurses, to be available if they needed anything, or to do various menial tasks. But something was different. During his shift, he got into an argument with a colleague. We don't know exactly what it was about, but we do know that the situation was so heated that he decided to leave the ward. More importantly, he was drunk. He had consumed alcohol while on duty, which in itself was a gross violation of work rules. Drunk, angry, frustrated. That's the mood he was in as he walked the corridors of the hospital. And then he came to the children's ward. Maybe he was just passing by. Maybe he had some errands to run, or maybe he went there on purpose because he knew there were children there and something dark inside him was awakened. He entered the ward. The nurses were busy in other places, taking care of other children, doing paperwork. There was no one there to watch him. And he saw an opportunity. He saw little defenseless children in cribs, and one of them was Barbara. What was going through his mind at that moment? Was it a spontaneous decision, or had he thought about it before? Had he planned it, or was it a sudden urge? Apparently it was a spontaneous act. It wasn't a premeditated action. He was drunk. He was out of his depth, and when he saw the opportunity, he just took it. He approached the crib. Barbara was lying there, maybe asleep. Maybe her eyes were open and looking at him. 7-month-old babies already recognize faces, already know who Mommy and Daddy are, but this man was no one familiar. He was a stranger in a white coat. He took her in his arms without hesitation. She was so small that she fit entirely in his hands. 7 months. That's the age when a baby weighs maybe 6 to 8 kilograms. She is still a very small, fragile creature. He took her and left the ward. He just took her away and nobody noticed. Nobody stopped the man in the white coat carrying the baby. Why would they? He was a hospital employee. Maybe he was carrying the baby somewhere for a checkup. Maybe someone asked him to. No one would have thought to stop him and ask what he was doing. He walked out of the hospital building and headed to the dormitory where he had his room. It was a dormitory for hospital employees, a place where those who didn't have their own place to live in Prague or who were on night duty and needed a place to sleep stayed. There were a number of rooms, shared bathrooms, kitchenettes. People would come and go, but at night, when most people were asleep, it was relatively quiet. He carried Barbara up to his room. He closed the door behind him. And now they were alone. A grown man and a 7-month-old girl. No one knew where they were. No one was looking for them. Not yet. What followed is something so horrifying it's hard to talk about. But I have to because it's important to remember what really happened. It's important not to sugarcoat it. This is the reality of evil. He started to undress her. He took off her clothes, her diaper. He wanted to see her naked body. A 7-month-old baby. A little girl who should be learning to crawl, laugh, explore the world. And instead, she became the object of a grown man's perverse desire. Then came the worst. He began to sexually abuse her. The body of a 7-month-old baby is not built for any kind of sexual contact. It's anatomically impossible without causing serious injury. And that's exactly what happened. He inflicted horrific injuries to her private parts. The pain she must have felt, we can't even imagine. And Barbara reacted the only way she could. She started crying. She screamed in pain, in terror. But that was no signal for him to stop. It was just a problem he had to solve. He was afraid that her crying would wake up the other people in the hostel. He was afraid someone would come and find out what she was doing. So he started choking her. He put his hand over her mouth and nose. Little Barbara couldn't fight back. She didn't have the strength to push his hand away. She couldn't get away. She couldn't call for help. She could only struggle for every breath that didn't come. How long did it take? A minute? 2? 5? Suffocation is a slow way to die. It's not instantaneous. The baby chokes, fighting for life, until finally the body gives up the fight and the heart stops beating. And all the while he kept his hand over her mouth, waiting for it to end. And then it was over. Barbara stopped fighting. Her little body went limp. She didn't cry anymore. She no longer breathed. She was dead. Now he had a problem. He had a dead baby in his room. He had to hide it somehow. He couldn't just leave it on the bed or on the floor. He had to figure out where to take him. He decided on the simplest solution. He hid it under his bed. He took her little body and stuck it under the bed where no one normally looks. Maybe he covered it with a blanket or some clothes so it wouldn't be seen. And then he'd probably lie down and wait to see what happened next. Meanwhile, someone in the children's ward finally realized that Barbara was missing. Maybe it was the nurse who went to check on the kids before the shift change. Maybe it was someone else. They looked in the crib and it was empty. The baby wasn't there. They started looking. First, they asked the other nurses, did anyone take her for a checkup? Had the parents come for her? No. No one knew. They started searching the ward. Maybe she fell out of her cot. Maybe she'd gone somewhere. But a 7-month-old baby can't go far, and certainly not from the ward. The panic began to grow. Where's the baby? Where has she gone? And then someone remembered. The paramedic. The one who left after the fight. Where is he? And that's when everyone realized something terrible had happened, that it wasn't just a lost child. It's a kidnapping. And maybe something even worse. The moment the nurses discovered that Barbara was missing from her crib was the beginning of one of the most intensive searches in the history of the Prague police. It was early in the morning of the 1st of May, 1990. A day that should have been a day of celebration and joy turned into a day of terror and despair. The staff of the children's department first carried out a thorough inspection of the entire area. They searched every corner of the ward, every room, every cupboard. They checked all the other cots to see if there were any. They asked all the nurses and doctors on the night shift if anyone had seen where she could be taken. Nobody knew anything. No one was taking her anywhere. No one was ordered to move her. That was the moment when the blood in the veins of everyone present stiffened. If the child is not in the ward and no one on staff has taken her, it means only one thing. Someone has taken her illegally. Someone took her straight from the hospital. The head doctor immediately called the police and also ordered all exits from the building closed. No one was allowed to leave until the situation was resolved. The police arrived within minutes. At that time, the public security, as the police were called in Czechoslovakia, was still in operation. Several cars arrived, dozens of uniformed and civilian investigators. They immediately began searching the entire hospital grounds. It was a huge area, the main buildings, annexes, technical rooms, warehouses, car parks, gardens. If the perpetrator was still on the premises, they had to find him. At the same time, they started questioning the staff. Who was on shift that night? Who had access to the children's ward? Anyone see anything suspicious? Did anyone hear anything unusual? Every staff member had to give a statement about where they were and what they were doing at critical hours. And here's where investigators learned something very interesting. One of the nurses mentioned an orderly who had a conflict with a colleague during the evening shift. She said that this orderly looked strange, that he was possibly intoxicated, that he was acting unusual. Another colleague confirmed that he had had an argument with this orderly, and that he had sent him away from the ward to go to the hostel to sleep. He promised to finish the job for him. This information was crucial. Investigators immediately focused on this orderly. What's his name? Where exactly does he live? Is he in a hostel now? Human Resources has provided all available information, name, address of the hostel, room number, and they started looking into his background. What they found shocked them. There was nothing suspicious in the personnel files, but when they asked for a criminal record, it turned out that this man had only recently been released from prison. And why was he there? For child sex offenses, for sexually abusing 2 little girls. He spent several years there and was released under a presidential amnesty. Investigators immediately realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a random abduction. It wasn't a confused parent taking someone else's child. He was a known child sexual predator who had access to the most vulnerable patients. And now he had a 7-month-old girl in his hands. Every minute could have been crucial. A team of investigators immediately went to the hospital staff quarters. It was a building near the main campus where orderlies, cleaners, and other support staff lived. It had several floors, dozens of rooms. The investigators knew the exact room number to go to. It was early in the morning. Most of the residents were still asleep. The corridors were quiet. The investigators walked silently to the door of the suspect's room. They stopped in front of it. Some of them had their hands on their guns, ready for anything. No one knew what awaited them beyond that door. Is there a child in there? Is he alive? Is the perpetrator alone, or does he have an accomplice? Is he armed? One of the investigators knocked on the door. Strong, authoritative. "Police, open up!" Nothing. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Open the door, it's the police!" There were noises inside. Someone was moving. Footsteps towards the door. And then the door slowly opened. A man in a t-shirt and pants stood in the doorway. He looked sleepy, confused. Or was he pretending to be sleepy? The investigators immediately pushed him back into the room and went inside. The room was small, spartanly furnished. A bed, a desk, a chair, a wardrobe. Typical dorm room. The investigators began to search the area. They opened the closet, clothes, personal effects. They looked behind the bed. Nothing. They checked every corner. And then one of the investigators bent down and looked under the bed. And there it was. A small body wrapped in something, hidden in a corner under the bed. The investigator reached under the bed and carefully pulled out what was lying there. It was a baby. 7-month-old Barbara. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was cold. The investigator, though a seasoned professional who had seen many terrible things, had to struggle with his emotions at that moment. He was holding a dead child, a baby who had her whole life ahead of her, a baby who had been entrusted to the care of a hospital and was supposed to be safe there. Instead, it ended up dead under the bed of a sexual predator. Other investigators immediately apprehended the suspect. They handcuffed him. They read him his rights. He was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. He offered no resistance. He made no threats. He didn't proclaim his innocence, he just kept quiet and let himself be taken away. The medical examiner and CSI were called to the scene. The room became a crime scene and had to be thoroughly documented. Photographers took pictures from every angle. CSIs collected evidence, fingerprints, biological traces, clothing, anything that could be used as evidence. Little Barbara's body was carefully transferred to the morgue for an autopsy. While the crime scene was being examined, the suspect was taken to the police station for questioning. He sat in the interrogation room, still in handcuffs. Across from him sat two experienced investigators. One of them switched on a tape recorder and began to record the interrogation. "Your name is Jaroslav Oplistil?" began the interrogator. The suspect nodded. "Do you work as an orderly at the hospital na Bulovce?" Another nod. "Where were you last night between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m.? And here's something surprising happened. He didn't hold back. He didn't deny it. He wasn't making up an alibi. He didn't say he didn't know anything. Instead, he confessed to everything. He said plain and simple what he did. He said he was drunk, that he had an argument with a colleague, that he went to a hostel, that he stopped at the children's ward on the way, that he heard a small child humming, that he was attracted to it, that he picked up the child and took it to his room. The investigators listened stone-faced, but inside, their stomachs were churning. Oplistil continued. He described how he undressed the child, how he began to sexually abuse him, how it started crying, how he was afraid the crying would wake up the other people in the hostel, how he put his hand over his mouth, how he stalked him, as he put it, how he stopped feeling the baby breathing. "And then what did you do?" the investigator asked. "I hid him under the bed," replied Oplistil. "And then?" "Then I went to sleep." He said this quite calmly, as if he were talking about something quite ordinary. The investigators had a confession, they had a crime scene, they had a body, they had the perpetrator. The case was clear. There was no need for complex forensics, no complicated investigation. The perp confessed to everything, but they still had to do everything they needed to do. The autopsy confirmed that Barbara died of asphyxiation. It also confirmed the brutal sexual abuse that preceded her death. The medical examiner documented all the injuries, all the evidence of violence on such a small body. Barbara's parents were informed of what happened. Imagine that moment. They'd been waiting 10 years for a baby. For 7 months, they enjoyed parenthood. And then the police come to tell them their daughter is dead. That she was kidnapped from the hospital, raped and murdered. Their world shattered into 1,000 pieces. The whole case from the disappearance of Barbara to the capture of the perpetrator took only a few hours. The police worked quickly, efficiently, professionally. It wasn't due to any advanced technology or sophisticated investigative methods. It was simply good police work, systematic questioning of witnesses, logical deductions, quick action. After the arrest and investigation, the trial preparation began. The prosecutor had to prepare an indictment that accurately described all the crimes Oplistil had committed. This was not just one charge, but several separate crimes that were committed simultaneously or in close succession. The first charge was kidnapping. He took a child from a hospital ward without the parents' permission, without the knowledge of the medical staff, and without any authorization. He took a stranger's child and took him to his private room. This fulfilled all the elements of the crime of kidnapping under the then Czechoslovak criminal code. Kidnapping was considered to be a very serious offense, especially when it involved the abduction of a child. The second charge was rape. According to the legal terminology of the time, it was sexual abuse, because the victim was a 7-month-old child who could not express consent or resistance. Sexual contact with such a young child was automatically considered a crime of the highest gravity. In her report, the medical examiner described in detail the injuries sustained by Barbara, and there was no doubt that brutal sexual violence had occurred. The third and most serious charge was that of murder. He had caused the child's death by preventing her from breathing. It was a deliberate act. He knew what he was doing when he pressed his hand to the child's mouth and nose. He knew he could cause death. And yet he did it. That met the definition of premeditated murder. The prosecution had an overwhelming amount of evidence. There was the confession of the perpetrator himself, which was tape-recorded and signed. There was an autopsy report confirming cause of death and sexual abuse. There were fingerprints, biological traces, testimony from medical personnel. There was documentation of his prior criminal history. There was simply no room for doubt. Oplistil was assigned an ex officio attorney. Even though his offense was perfectly clear and he admitted to it, he was entitled to a defense. The defense counsel found himself in an almost impossible situation. How do you defend someone who confessed to raping and murdering an infant? The only possible strategy was to argue diminished sanity, insanity, something that might mitigate the sentence. That's why a psychiatric evaluation was ordered. A team of psychiatrists and psychologists conducted a thorough examination of Oplistil. They examined his personality, his sexual orientation, his impulsivity, his ability to control his actions. They interviewed him, ran tests, observed his behavior. The results of the examinations were unequivocal. He was suffering from pedophilia, a sexual deviancy directed at children. This disorder was not new. He had been proven to have it for years, as evidenced by his previous criminal activity. But the important finding was that this pedophilia was aggressive in nature. He was not just someone who had inappropriate fantasies, he was someone who acted out his fantasies and used violence in doing so. As for sanity, the psychiatrists concluded that Oplistil was sane at the time of the crime. Yes, he was sexually deviant. Yes, he was under the influence of alcohol. But he understood what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was criminal. He had enough control over his actions that he was able to take the child, lock himself in a room with the child, commit the act, and then hide the body. All of this required a certain amount of planning and awareness of the consequences. Therefore, he could not be considered insane. The trial took place at the municipal court in Prague. It was a trial that attracted enormous media attention. Journalists crowded the courtroom, wanting to catch every word, every detail. The public demanded justice. They demanded severe punishment. Barbara's parents came to the courtroom to face the man who killed their daughter. I don't know if you can understand the strength they must have had to come there at all, to look into the eyes of their child's killer. He was sitting in the dock. Reporters described him as looking calm, almost indifferent. He didn't seem weighed down by guilt or regret. When the judge read the indictment, he listened without visible emotion. When questions were put to him, he answered in a stern, matter-of-fact manner. And then came the moment that surprised everyone. He made an unusual request to the court. He asked to be sentenced to death. He wanted to be executed himself. He said he was aware of what he had done and that he deserved the ultimate punishment. Was it manipulation? An attempt to gain sympathy by showing remorse? Or was he sincere? Psychiatrists later said it was probably just another manifestation of his personality disorder. He felt no real regret for the child's death, but he realized that his life would never be normal again, that he would forever be labeled a child killer, and perhaps he saw death as an easier path. But there was a major complication. The death penalty no longer existed. And do you know when it was abolished? April 29th, 1999, just one day before Barbara was murdered. One single day. If Oplistil had committed his crime 24 hours earlier, he could theoretically have been sentenced to death. But the law was the law, and it didn't apply retroactively. So the judge had to look for the maximum penalty that was possible under the new legal system. Life imprisonment had not yet been introduced in Czechoslovakia at that time. The highest possible sentence was 25 years imprisonment, and that is precisely the sentence that the judge imposed. 25 years in prison for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a 7-month-old baby. To many, it sounded like too light a sentence. Barbara's parents lost their baby forever, and the perpetrator is only going to get 25 years. After 25 years, will he be able to walk free and start a new life? Where is the justice in this? But the judge had one more tool to ensure that Oplistil would not pose a danger after his sentence. In addition to the prison sentence, he ordered inpatient protective psychiatric treatment. This meant that even after serving 25 years in prison, he would not automatically be released. Instead, he would be transferred to a psychiatric hospital where he would have to undergo treatment for his sexual deviance. And he will only be released from this hospital when psychiatrists decide that he is no longer a danger to society. This decision was crucial. It ensured that Oplistil would not be able to simply walk free after serving his sentence. He would first have to prove that he was cured, that he was no longer a pedophile, that he was no longer a danger to children. And as we know today, pedophilia is a disorder that is very difficult to cure, if at all. The verdict was announced in the presence of the media, the public, and the parents of the victim. Oplistil heard his sentence without reaction. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he didn't protest. He simply accepted the sentence and was taken back into custody. The defense appealed, but it was denied. The sentence became final. Jaroslav Oplistil was sentenced to 25 years in prison, followed by inpatient protective treatment for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 7-month-old Barbara. The case was closed, but questions remained. How is it possible that he ever made it to the hospital? Why hadn't he been vetted? Who bears responsibility for the systemic failure that allowed this tragedy to occur? The psychiatric assessment of Jaroslav Oplistil was one of the most important elements of the entire legal process. It was not just a formality, but a crucial step that would determine how the offender would be treated not only during his sentence, but also afterwards. Let us examine in detail how such a psychiatric examination took place and what conclusions the psychiatrists reached. The psychiatric examination was ordered by the court before the main trial. The judge needed to know several crucial things. First, was Oplistil sane at the time of the crime? Did he understand what he was doing? Could he control his actions? Second, what mental disorder, if any, did he have? Third, is he a danger to society in the future? And fourth, is he amenable to treatment? A team of experts has been appointed to conduct an examination. It wasn't just one psychiatrist, but a group of specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, maybe even sexologists. These people had years of experience investigating offenders, especially those with sexual motivations. They knew what questions to ask, how to evaluate the answers, how to spot manipulation or malingering. The first part of the investigation was the history, that is, gathering information about Oplistil's life. The psychiatrists asked about his childhood. What was his family like? Did he have siblings? What was his relationship with his parents, especially his mother? Were there any traumatic events? Was he himself abused as a child? This is an important question because many sexual predators have a history of sexual abuse, although this is obviously not the rule and certainly not an excuse. They asked about his education. Did he finish elementary school? Did he learn any trades? How did he do in school? Did he have friends? Or was he more of a loner, isolated from his peers? They asked about his work history. What kind of work did he do? How long did he last in them? Did he have any conflicts with co-workers or supervisors? Sexual history was very important. When did he have his first sexual experience? Who was it with? How old was he? They asked about his adult sexual relationships. Did he have any female partners? How long did these relationships last? Was he capable of normal sexual intercourse with an adult woman? Or did he have trouble getting an erection, getting satisfaction? And then came the hard questions. When did he first feel sexual attraction to children? How old were the children he was attracted to? Were they girls, boys, or both? What fantasies did he have? What exactly was it about children that turned him on? Their innocence, their vulnerability, their small bodies. He had to answer all these questions. The psychiatrists listened intently not only to what he said, but how he said it. Does he show emotion when he talks about his victims? Or does he speak mechanically without participation? Does he try to minimize his actions? Does he blame the victims? Or does he exaggerate their guilt in order to gain sympathy? In addition to the interviews, psychological tests were also conducted. There are a number of tests that can reveal different aspects of personality. One of the most famous is the Rorschach test, the one with ink blots, where the patient says what they see in them. By how he interprets the ambiguous images, one can infer his inner world, his fears, desires, conflicts. Another test that is often used is the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is a long questionnaire with hundreds of questions that maps different aspects of personality, tendencies to depression, anxiety, paranoia, antisocial behavior, psychopathology. He had to fill out these questionnaires honestly, and the psychiatrists then evaluated the results. Special sexological tests may have been used. For example, plethysmography. This is a method that measures the reactions of the genitals to various sexual stimuli. The patient is shown pictures or videos of different types: adult women, adult men, children of different ages. The device measures at what stimuli an erection occurs. It is an objective method to determine true sexual preference because the body does not lie, although the mouth may. After all these examinations, the psychiatrists began to compile their findings, and this finding was absolutely crucial to the whole case. The main diagnosis was clear: pedophilia. It's a sexual disorder characterized by a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to prepubescent children. It's not just an occasional fantasy or curiosity, it's a permanent, deep-seated sexual orientation. For the pedophile, children are the primary object of sexual desire. But that wasn't all. Psychiatrists found that Oplistil's pedophilia had a specific character. It was aggressive. What does that mean? There are different types of pedophiles. Some are so-called fixated. Their interest in children is exclusive and permanent. Others are regressive. They normally prefer adult partners, but turn to children in situations of stress or frustration. Some pedophiles are relatively harmless in the sense that they do not act out their fantasies, or if they do so in a nonviolent way, for example through child pornography or more innocuous forms of contact. But then there are aggressive pedophiles. They use force, violence, intimidation. They don't care if the child suffers. In fact, it may be that the suffering of the child is part of their thrill. Oplistil clearly fell into the latter category. His previous actions with the two girls in the woods made that clear, threatening them with death, forcing them to undress, forcing them to touch his genitals. And now he has committed an even worse act, raping and killing a 7-month-old baby. This is not a pedophile seeking a loving relationship with a child, as some of them rationalize their actions. This is a brutal sexual predator. Psychiatrists have also assessed his level of empathy. Empathy is the ability to empathize with other people's feelings, to understand their suffering. When a normal person sees or imagines a suffering child, they feel compassion, pity, the need to help. But in some people, especially those with antisocial personality traits, empathy is reduced or completely absent. In Oplistil's case, empathy was minimal. When he spoke about his victims, he showed no remorse. He didn't cry. He didn't say things like, "I imagine how much I ruined that life." He spoke of children as objects, not as human beings with feelings. That's a very bad sign, because the absence of empathy means a high risk of recidivism, repeating the crime. Another important finding was that Oplistil had very poor impulse control. Impulsivity is the inability to resist immediate stimuli, even when you know it will have bad consequences. A normal person, even if he has some inappropriate desire, can say to himself, "No, I can't do that. That would be bad." But an impulsive person acts immediately, without thinking of the consequences. Oplistil's action clearly showed this. It was not a planned attack. He was drunk, frustrated, walking past the children's ward, and suddenly decided to take the child. He just did it. He didn't say, "Wait, this is crazy, I can't do this, I'll end up in jail." He just followed his impulse. The psychiatrists also assessed whether he had any other mental disorder. Does he have schizophrenia? Hallucinating? Is he delusional? The answer was no. He's not psychotic. He's not detached from reality. He knows where he is, who he is, what's going on around him. His thinking is logical, coherent. Is he depressed? Anxiety disorder? Something to explain his behavior? Again, no. He has sexual deviance and antisocial traits, but no classic mental illness that would absolve him of responsibility, and that was the key conclusion of the psychiatrists. He was sane at the time of the crime. He understood the nature and consequences of his actions. He knew that what he was doing was wrong and criminal. He could control his actions, although it was difficult because of his impulsivity and sexual deviance. Therefore, he could not be exonerated from criminal responsibility. But the psychiatrists also made it clear that Oplistil was a high risk to society. His pedophilia is deep and enduring, his aggression is extreme, his empathy is minimal, his impulsivity is high. All of this combined means that he is likely to commit further sexual violence against children if given the opportunity. Therefore, the psychiatrists recommended that in addition to a prison sentence, inpatient protective treatment be ordered. This means that he will not be released after serving his sentence, but will be transferred to a specialized psychiatric hospital where he will be treated for his sexual deviance. What treatment is there for pedophilia? This is a complex question. Pedophilia is not something that can be cured in the true sense of the word. It is not possible to change a person's sexual orientation. But one can teach a person to control his impulses, to recognize risky situations, to develop strategies to avoid them. Psychotherapy is one method. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps the patient recognize and change the patterns of thinking that lead to risky behavior. For example, learning to recognize situations where he or she is tempted and developing strategies to avoid them. Pharmacological treatment is another option. There are medications that reduce testosterone levels and thus sex drive, so-called chemical castration. The patient takes drugs that suppress his sexual desires to a minimum. This can be effective, but only as long as the patient takes the medication. Once he stops taking them, the urges return. The social environment and supervision are also important. If a person is supervised regularly, has limited access to children, has a structured day, and has the support of professionals, the risk of relapse decreases. So the psychiatrists wrote in their final assessment that Oplistil needs long-term intensive treatment in a closed facility where he will have no access to children and where he will be under constant supervision by professionals. This is the only way to minimize the risk of him committing another crime. After his conviction, Oplistil entered prison where he was to spend the next decade. But what happened to him during those long years behind bars? How was his imprisonment, and what happened when his sentence began to come to an end? This is a question that interested not only experts but also the public, because everyone wanted to know if this man was still dangerous. While serving his sentence, Oplistil was placed in a regular prison where he shared space with other convicts. There is an informal hierarchy among the prisoners in the prison, and those who have harmed children are at the very bottom of this hierarchy. The other prisoners often bully them, assault them, isolate them. It is a paradox. People who have committed serious crimes themselves find sexual violence against children so abhorrent that they distance themselves from such offenders. We don't know exactly how Oplistil handled the situation, whether he was isolated from other prisoners for his own safety, or whether he somehow integrated into the prison community. What we do know is that he had access to some form of psychiatric care during his time in prison. Prisons have psychiatrists and psychologists who look after the mental health of prisoners, particularly those with diagnosed disorders. He probably underwent some form of therapy, maybe group therapy with other sex offenders, maybe individual sessions with a psychologist. These therapies are designed to help offenders understand the causes of their behavior, develop empathy for their victims, and learn strategies to prevent further offenses. But the success of such programs is highly questionable. Many experts argue that pedophilia is a deep-seated disorder that cannot be truly cured. You can teach a person to control his impulses, but you can't change his basic sexual orientation. And for aggressive pedophiles like Oplistil, the prognosis is even worse. As the years passed, Oplistil neared the end of his sentence. 25 years is a long time. He was in his early 30s when he entered prison. By the time he was nearing the end of his sentence, he was an older man in his 60s. His body had changed, he had aged. But what about his mind? What about his sexual deviance? Did it disappear with age, as it sometimes does? Or was it still present, just waiting for an opportunity? The year 2015 was a pivotal year. He had served most of his sentence, and the date of his possible release was approaching. But this is where the part of the sentence I mentioned earlier, the order for inpatient protective treatment, came into play. This meant that he could not automatically be released just because he had served his sentence. The court had to reassess whether Oplistil was still a danger to society. A new psychiatric examination was ordered for this purpose. A team of psychiatrists re-examined Oplistil, his current mental state, his sexual preferences, his level of risk of reoffending. The psychiatrists ran tests similar to those they had run a quarter of a century ago. Interviews, psychological tests, assessments of his behavior during incarceration. They also spoke to prison staff. How did Oplistil behave during his years in prison? Did he have any disciplinary infractions? Did he show interest in children when he had the opportunity to see them, for example, when visiting other prisoners? Did he participate in therapeutic programs? And if so, was he successful in them? The results of this new expertise were disturbing. The psychiatrists concluded that although Oplistil had aged and his physical condition had deteriorated, his pedophilia had not gone anywhere. He still showed a sexual interest in young children. He still had minimal empathy for his victims. He still posed a high risk of recidivism if released unsupervised. While age may reduce sexual appetite in general, for many sexual predators the underlying deviance remains present into old age. And Oplistil was not old enough to say that he was no longer capable of committing another crime. Based on this expertise, the court ruled that Oplistil could not be released. Instead, in 2015, he was transferred from a regular prison to a secure psychiatric hospital. This facility is a cross between a prison and a hospital. Patients are there not as in prison for punishment, but as a precautionary measure to prevent them from harming themselves or others. His treatment continued in the psychiatric hospital. More intensive than in prison, more focused on his specific issues. Maybe he was given testosterone-lowering medication to reduce his sex drive. Maybe he had regular therapy sessions to control his impulses and develop empathy. But the key question was, how long would he stay there? Inpatient protective treatment has no fixed duration. It can last years. It can last the rest of your life. It depends on how the patient responds to treatment, whether his condition improves, whether his risk of harming others decreases. Periodically, usually once every year or two, psychiatrists must report to the court on the patient's condition. The court then decides whether treatment should continue or whether the patient can be discharged. To be released, the psychiatrists would have to certify that the patient no longer poses a significant risk to the community. In Oplistil's case, this was highly unlikely. His act was extremely brutal. He abused and killed a 7-month-old baby. His previous criminal activity showed a pattern of repeated violence against children. His psychiatric profiles showed a deep, untreatable deviance. What psychiatrist would be willing to sign an evaluation saying such a man was no longer dangerous? What judge would be willing to take responsibility for his release? Experts who have followed his case agree that Oplistil is likely to spend the rest of his life in a locked facility, either in a psychiatric hospital or, if his health declines significantly, perhaps in a secure medical facility, but he'll probably never be free again. And that may be the right decision. Society has a right to protect itself from people who pose an extreme danger. And if we look at the statistics of recidivism for child sexual predators, especially those with aggressive traits, it is very high. Many of them, if given the opportunity, will commit another crime. The Oplistil case has become a precedent for how to deal with such offenders. It showed that imprisonment alone is not enough. Long-term, perhaps lifelong control and treatment are needed. A system is needed that can identify high-risk individuals and ensure that they do not have the opportunity to harm other innocent victims. This tragic case has had far-reaching consequences for the entire child protection system in the Czech Republic. It has exposed huge gaps in safeguarding measures and has been the catalyst for widespread changes in legislation and practice. Let us examine in detail what specific changes this case has brought about. The first and most significant change was the introduction of mandatory vetting of healthcare workers. Until then, there was no legal obligation for hospitals and healthcare facilities to request a criminal record check for new employees. This has radically changed. A law was passed that made it clear that anyone who is to work in a healthcare facility and will have contact with patients, especially children, must provide a clean criminal record. This rule applied not only to doctors and nurses, but to all employees, orderlies, cleaners, technical staff, cooks, just anyone who might have access to patients. Employers have been given a clear obligation to request this statement before the employment contract is concluded, and this was not a one-time thing. The statements had to be updated at regular intervals to ensure that the employee had not committed a crime while still working in the facility. Similar changes were introduced in the education sector. Teachers, educators, teaching assistants, school cafeteria workers, even maintenance workers in schools, all had to undergo background checks. It was logical. If we protect children in hospitals, we must also protect them in schools, kindergartens, children's camps, sports clubs, wherever they are in the care of adults. Another important change was the regulation of criminal records. Until then, the system had been slow, inefficient, and often inaccurate. Information was updated with great delay. Records from different courts were difficult to link. All this had to be modernized. The digitization of criminal records began, creating a central database where all information was immediately available. A system was also introduced where employers could electronically request an extract from the register, which greatly speeded up the whole process. Instead of having to go to the court in person, wait in queues, and then wait weeks for the document to be issued, job seekers could now obtain a statement online in a matter of days. Another very important change was the tightening of the conditions for amnesty. After Havel's amnesty and its controversial consequences, everyone realized that amnesties had to be much more carefully worded. It cannot be so broad that it releases even dangerous offenders. It must contain clear exceptions and categories of people to whom it does not apply. In particular, sexual offenses against children have been added to the list of exceptions to amnesties as a separate category. It should never again be the case that someone convicted of child sexual abuse will be released early under an amnesty. This change was passed with great consensus across the political spectrum. No one wanted to risk a repeat of a similar tragedy. Hospitals also significantly strengthened their internal safety protocols. New procedures were introduced in children's wards. For example, a rule that no child could be moved from the ward without a written order from a doctor and the knowledge of the head nurse. Every movement of a child had to be recorded in a special register: who took them, where, why, when, and who was responsible. A system of identification bracelets was introduced for all hospitalized children. These wristbands contained the child's name, date of birth, room number. Some of the more advanced systems even contained electronic chips that triggered an alarm if a child was taken out of the ward without authorization. Access to children's wards was more strictly controlled. It was no longer possible for anyone to just walk in. Security doors with electronic locks were installed, which could only be unlocked with a staff member's card. Cameras were placed in corridors, at entrances, in waiting rooms. Not in the rooms themselves that would violate the privacy of the patients, but in places where someone suspicious might pass. Staff were also more thoroughly trained in recognizing suspicious behavior. Nurses and doctors were taught to look out for the warning signs. A staff member who spends an unusually large amount of time with child patients for no clear reason. Someone who volunteers to work with children when it is not their job. Someone who tries to be alone with children. Clear procedures have been established for reporting suspicions. If a member of staff suspected that a colleague was behaving inappropriately, they had a duty to report this to their line manager. And importantly, these reports were protected. The reporter was not to be penalized or bullied for raising a possible problem. In the broader context of society as a whole, a larger discussion began about child protection in general. The media began to report more on the issue of child sexual abuse, how to spot the warning signs, how to protect children. Parents were educated that the danger was not just from strangers on the street, but often from people in positions of trust, teachers, coaches, even family members. New organizations and helplines were created where children or parents could call if they suspected abuse. These lines were anonymous, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Staff on these lines were trained in how to talk to traumatized children, how to assess risk, how to coordinate help. The police and the justice system also adjusted their procedures. Specialized units have been created to investigate crimes against children. Officers in these units have received special training: how to interview child victims so that they are not further traumatized, how to collect evidence in these sensitive cases, how to work with victims' families. The courts began to take these cases much more seriously. Penalties for sexual violence against children have been toughened. A sexual predator registry was introduced, where all those convicted of these crimes were registered. Once released from prison, they had to report their whereabouts, could not work with children, and could not live near schools or playgrounds. All these changes had one common goal: to ensure that a tragedy like the one with little Barbara would never happen again, to ensure that the system has safeguards, controls, mechanisms to detect dangerous individuals before they have the opportunity to harm children. When the news of what happened at the Nebulovci hospital became public, it caused an unprecedented media storm. You have to realize the times in which this took place. It was the year 1999, just a few months after the Velvet Revolution. The media had finally gained freedom, could write about anything without censorship. And this case was something that shocked the whole society. The first reports appeared during the 1st of May, almost immediately after the discovery of the body and the arrest of the perpetrator. Czechoslovak radio interrupted its regular broadcasts with an extraordinary report. The announcer read a brief report that an infant had been kidnapped and murdered in a Prague hospital. The details were not yet known, but the information alone was enough to make people at the radio station freeze in horror. The evening edition of the newspaper carried much more detailed information. The front pages of all the major newspapers were devoted to the case. The Red Law, which was still the main daily, carried an extensive article with a photograph of the hospital. Lidov Noviny, which had just been transformed from a samizdat periodical into a full-fledged daily, devoted several pages to the case. Mlada Fronta, Svobodne Slovo, all the main newspapers wrote about nothing else. The headlines were appalling. Horror in the hospital. 7-month-old baby murdered by his own orderly. Amnesty releases baby killer. Journalists were racing to see who could bring more details, who could reveal more information. They wrote about the course of the crime, about the perpetrator, about his past, about how he got to the hospital in the first place. Television news gave the case a prime spot on the evening news. Cameramen filmed outside the hospital where crowds were gathering. The reporters were trying to get statements from the hospital authorities, from the police, from anyone who could provide information. The footage showed police cars, ambulances, closed parts of the hospital grounds. What was interesting about the media coverage was how quickly the focus shifted from the crime itself to broader issues. Yes, everyone was horrified by the brutality of the act, but soon the questions began to emerge. How is it possible that a convicted sexual predator worked in a children's ward? Who was responsible? Was it a failure of the hospital, or a failure of the entire system? Journalists began to investigate the circumstances of the amnesty. They asked how many people were actually released. How many were sex offenders? How many had returned to crime? Articles appeared criticizing the broad scope of the amnesty, pointing out that it was well-intentioned but had unintended consequences. President Václav Havel found himself under pressure. The media asked him to comment. Critics pointed out that his amnesty had made this tragedy possible. Havel eventually issued a statement expressing deep regret for what had happened. He said the amnesty was meant as a gesture of forgiveness and a fresh start, but admitted it may have been too broad. He promised that a similar situation would not happen again. The public reaction was even more intense than the media coverage. People were absolutely shocked. At that time, there were still so-called talks, or public meetings where people gathered to discuss current events. And this case was the #1 topic. In the factories, in the offices, in the streets, everywhere, this was the talk. Many people were expressing anger. How is it possible that something like this could happen? How could a hospital admit such a person? Why wasn't he checked? There were voices calling for the heads of those responsible. The director of the hospital, the personnel manager, anyone who had anything to do with the hiring of Oplistil was the target of criticism. Parents of young children were terrified. They suddenly realized that places they had thought were safe, hospitals, schools, daycares, might not be. They began to question who was looking after their children when they were not present. They began to demand information about the staff at these facilities. They wanted to know that the people they were entrusting their children to were trustworthy. A place of remembrance was spontaneously created in front of the Bulovka hospital. People brought flowers, candles, stuffed toys. Hundreds of people who never knew little Barbara came to express their sympathy and solidarity with her parents. It was touching. The whole community came together to mourn the loss of a life. There were also petitions. One demanded tighter controls on health and education workers. It gathered tens of thousands of signatures in a few weeks. Another petition demanded changes to amnesty laws. People wanted their voices to be heard so that politicians would understand that society was demanding change. Church leaders also spoke out on the case. In their sermons, priests spoke about the evil that exists in the world, the need to protect the innocent, and society's responsibility for its most vulnerable members. There were special masses for the soul of little Barbara. People prayed for her parents, for all the victims of violence. Experts, psychiatrists, psychologists, criminologists were invited on radio and television to explain what pedophilia is, how such persons operate, how to recognize them, how to protect oneself from them. For many people, it was the first time they had encountered these concepts. Child sexual abuse was a topic that was not talked about in communist Czechoslovakia. Now suddenly it was everywhere. Some voices called for the return of the death penalty. They argued that 25 years was too little for such a terrible crime, that the only justice was death. There were discussions on the subject in the newspapers, on the radio, in public forums. It was a controversial debate that divided society. Other people pointed out that the death penalty was not the solution, that prevention was more important, to ensure that such persons did not get into a position where they could do harm in the first place, that the system must be set up to detect at-risk individuals earlier. The media continued to cover the case during the trial. Every day of the trial was detailed in the newspapers. Reporters sat in the courtroom and recorded every word. The public wanted to know everything: what the perpetrator said, how he behaved, what the witnesses said, what the evidence was. When the verdict was delivered, the media analyzed it from all sides. Some commentators said it was a fair sentence. Others said it was too lenient. The debate continued for weeks after the trial ended. The case also became a topic in the cultural sphere. Writers wrote articles and essays about it. Some used it as an example of how rapid social change can have unintended consequences. Others used him as a warning of the dangers that lurked for children. For a long time, this case remained in the collective memory of society. It became a reference point, a symbol of a tragedy that happened because of a systemic failure. Even years later, when a similar case came to light, journalists and commentators remembered the case of little Barbara as a warning, as a reminder of what can happen when there are insufficient safety measures. So we have come to the end of this difficult, painful story. I know it has been difficult to watch, but it is important that we talk about these cases. It is important that we realize that evil exists and that we must be constantly on guard to protect the most vulnerable among us. As I look back on this whole case now, I see some important lessons that we can take away from it. And these lessons are still relevant today, more than 30 years after the tragedy. The first and most important lesson is that trust must always be accompanied by verification. We cannot just blindly believe that a man in a white coat, a man with titles, a man in uniform is automatically good and trustworthy. We must have systems that verify that people in positions of trust actually deserve that trust. This applies to healthcare, to education, to any area where adults work with children. As parents, as caregivers, as a society, we have an obligation to ask questions. We have a right to know who is looking after our children. We have a right to demand that institutions have strict safety protocols. And if something seems strange, if we have a bad feeling, we need to say it out loud. It is better to be cautious, and maybe even wrong, than to be silent and then regret it. The second lesson is about understanding sexual predators. We must realize that these people often look perfectly normal. They are not the monsters with horns and tails that we might imagine them to be. They are people who can be kind, polite, helpful. They often deliberately put themselves in positions where they have access to children, becoming coaches, teachers, scout leaders, just to have an opportunity. That's why it's so crucial that organizations working with children have clear procedures and boundaries. Never should an adult be alone with a child in an enclosed space without the knowledge of other people. There should always be transparency, supervision, the possibility of control. This is not distrust of specific people. It is simply common sense and protection for all involved. The third lesson concerns the importance of professional monitoring of at-risk individuals. We know that sexual predators have a very high recidivism rate. If someone has harmed a child once, the likelihood that they will do it again is alarming. That is why we need long-term monitoring systems for these people. A sexual predator registry is not a violation of their rights. It is a protection of the rights of all children to be safe. And we need to be realistic about treatment. Yes, some people can be successfully treated and can learn to control their impulses. But for the most serious cases, those with aggressive traits, the prognosis is very poor. And in such cases, the safety of society, especially the safety of children, must take precedence over the freedom of the individual. The fourth lesson concerns political decisions and their consequences. Every decision, even if well-intended, can have unexpected side effects. The amnesty was a beautiful gesture of forgiveness and hope, but it was not sufficiently thought through in terms of protecting the public. This teaches us that we need to think of all possible scenarios when making laws and policies, to ask what if, to consult with experts, to be cautious. The fifth lesson is about the importance of communication and education. Children need to be educated about what is appropriate and inappropriate adult behavior. They need to know that they have the right to say no, even to an adult. They need to know that there are parts of their body that no one has the right to touch. They need to know that if something bad happens, it is not their fault and they should tell someone they trust. Parents in turn need to be able to listen. Children often give signals that something is wrong. They may not mention it directly, but their behavior changes. They become withdrawn, fearful, aggressive, have nightmares. We need to be attentive to these changes and ask what is happening. The sixth lesson is about the power of community. When tragedy strikes, it is not the time to point fingers and look for culprits. It is a time to come together, to support the victims and their families, to work together to prevent it from happening again. The memorial outside the hospital showed that even strangers can show empathy and solidarity. That is something beautiful in the midst of the horror. The seventh and final lesson is about the value of every life. Little Barbara had her whole life ahead of her. She was going to learn to walk, talk, go to school, make friends, fall in love, maybe have children of her own. It was all taken from her in one night. Her life had value. Every child's life has value, and it is our duty as a society to do everything we can to protect those lives. I'd like to close by remembering Barbara and her parents. I can't even imagine the pain they must have experienced and still must experience. Losing a child is the hardest thing that can happen to a parent. Losing them in this way is something you never fully recover from. I hope they found some peace, some way to live with this loss. I thank you for sticking with me to the end of this difficult video. I know it wasn't pleasant to listen to, but it's important to know these stories. They are stories that teach us, that warn us, that remind us why we need to be vigilant. If you liked the video, or rather if you think it's important to talk about these things, give it a like and share it. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. And most importantly, talk about these things with your loved ones, with your children. Education and open communication are our best defense. Take care of yourselves and protect those who need it. See you in the next video. Bye, guys.